Prince, it's great to have you back on Uncensored. First of all, if I may get your reaction to the attack by Iran directly on Israel's soil.
Well, you know, these are signs of a regime that is becoming more and more desperate and vulnerable. At the same time, it's launching an attack against Israel. It has been launching an attack at home on Iranian women and trying to, again, exercise its repression at home. This is going to be an ongoing problem, and I think ultimately the world needs to realize that the root cause of many problems we see in the area, and not just this one instance, but in general, is the regime's nature and behavior. It has not only affected Iranians or Israelis, it has also affected Syrians, Iraqis, Lebanese, and other immediate neighbors in the region.
Iran has operated through proxies for a number of years, obviously. This is the first time they've directly attacked Israel in this manner. How significant is this escalation?
Well, I think a lot of it is perhaps mostly for home consumption, to say we've done something. One thing that was really rendering it even more of a mockery is that despite launching so many different missiles and drones, none of them actually reached targets. So was it really an exercise for purposes of domestic consumption, or was it actually the intent to escalate? I think this time Khamenei took a huge gamble, assuming that probably there will be a lot of pressure to keep the Israelis from retaliating. But then again, I think we should look beyond the tit-for-tat argument. I think the world needs to now really scratch their head and say, look, diplomacy has failed. Our expectation of behavior change from this regime over decades is pointless. The time has come to look for an ultimate solution to the problem. If we indeed want to avoid escalation, you have to put an end to this regime, which is the ask of the Iranian people in the first place. But the world needs to seriously consider that the only solution and alternative is regime change in Iran.
But how does the world affect regime change in Iran?
Well, two things. Number one is to actually increase even more pressure on the regime economically by means of expanding the sanctions. I think it is time that the G7 and the European countries join the U.S. in putting the IRGC on the terror list. This will further put pressure on the regime to target the regime's officials individually on their personal assets, to expel their diplomats or elements associated with the regime that roam freely in European and American cities. And actually implement further oil sanctions, which, by the way, were not properly implemented, which simply gave the regime more money, which, of course, it spent on its proxies, whether the Houthis or Hamas and what have you. That's on the external factor aspect. Parallel to this needs to be a policy of maximum support. That means support for the Iranian people in their struggle against this regime. And that could come in many forms. I think the most important one is to make sure that Iranians remain connected to the world, and therefore internet access is key. I've mentioned that many times before. Elon Musk with Starlink have done their part. I think we need more of that happening. There are means of perhaps making exceptions to some of the current limitations of the inability for Iranians to, let's say, send money back home, because as you know, under the current sanctions, it's impossible to transfer money. We are only limited to some digital currency. That could be at least an exception to the rule to make it easier for us to support families at home, especially our working force, if they want to go on strike, not to remain completely impoverished and unable to actually do that. And there are many other elements. I know there are too many details to discuss in one short interview, but there are many ways to equal the playing field for the Iranians, and that could be a dual element of pressure from in the interior of the country as well as external pressure. This could be a recipe that could lead to a successful transition.
Obviously, a lot of speculation about what Israel's response will be to this unprecedented missile strike. Do you think it would be a smart strategy for Israel to launch an attack directly into Iran, as some of the more right-wing members of the cabinet apparently want to do?
You know, I cannot speculate as to what would be the decision internally at the level of cabinet and what's been decided. And I know there's a lot of back and forth between different countries that are consulting with the Israeli government. But I can tell you one thing. At the end of the day, I think that Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman, and many others in the region know that we cannot only remain focused on, again, what can happen or not, and whether or not this could escalate beyond. I think everybody in the region understands that so long as the regime and its nature is constantly creating havoc towards more extremism, more radicalism, more instability, more threats, we cannot contemplate any solution other than dealing only with the status quo. We need to start strategically thinking beyond the status quo. These are the kind of discussions I had recently, at least last year when I was in Israel, visiting that country, and what I've been talking about with foreign countries in Europe and the United States, whether legislators or in government. There has to be ultimately a fundamental shift in overall policy as they deal with the Islamic regime in Iran. And that would mean that rather than staying only focused on how do we respond or what's proportional response and what are the collateral elements, because we know people are suffering. We know Iranians are suffering, Israelis are suffering, Palestinians are suffering, but all because of this regime. So the only remedy ultimately, while we are looking at the immediate response, is a general shift in policy. That is the only way we can get out of this mess and solve really a problem for the region in terms of stability and peace, and of course, beyond that, what could rectify what the regime from its beginning has derailed, which is peace and stability in our region.
What is your message to President Biden? Because clearly America's role in this will be absolutely crucial.
I think this administration needs to realize that what has happened in terms of appeasement, when you're releasing money to this regime, it only emboldens it to do even more of what it's done. I wonder if this had not happened about a year ago as a continuation of attempt of reaching another nuclear deal with the Iranians or paying ransoms for release of their hostages, whether or not that factor did not directly contribute to the Hamas attack against Israel. These are the kind of questions that needs to be really answered, and I haven't had any response to this question heard here in Washington. It's not too late. I mean, look at it. The Abraham Accords was going on in a very positive way. The regime very astutely tried to sabotage it, and again, cleverly using its proxies, because it every time wants to take credit for it without being accountable for it. This is the time to finally keep the regime accountable. And I don't think that the policy of appeasement works. It only emboldens the regime, and the consequences is more suffering for the people. There needs to be now strong leadership. We need the same kind of leadership that we saw between Roosevelt and Churchill at the end of the Second World War. We need to have the same resolve that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had to put an end to the Soviet communist system in Russia. Today, we need the same kind of strong leadership emanating from the free Western world in support of democracy and freedom and human rights in a country that could be the pivotal element in changing everything that this regime has done to divert us from that rail. And I think Iran is going to be the most important strategic partner to key countries in the area, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others, to bring about that change. And we need to work with one another. And I hope that world leaders will finally decide to consider this issue very seriously. And I stand ready to present to them our viewpoints on behalf of my compatriots of how they can best find a solution that is win-win, which is in the interest of the Iranian people, but also in their own interest, whether it's national security or even down the line economic interest.
Crown Prince Pahlavi, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time.
Thanks for having me again, Piers.